When I go,
Good night, ladies and gentlemen. Hello. Barnes & Noble is pleased to welcome authors Susan B. and Joseph Trento as they discuss their book titled Unsafe at Any Altitude, Failed Terrorism Investigations, Scapegoating 9/11. We may be less safe flying today than we were before 9/11, and we have spent billions of dollars in tax money going backward. Unsafe at Any Altitude goes behind the scenes at our nation's airports and penetrates the government to paint a picture of a transportation security administration that is remarkably inept and reveals the great lengths that the U.S. carries and their lobbyists have gone to make certain that serious airline security has not been instituted in this country. Susan B. Trento is an author and journalist who began her career on staff in the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives. Her investigations into the space shuttle safety, counterintelligence, and lobbying have led to the publications of the books Prescription for Disaster, Windows, and Powerhouse. Joseph J. Trento is an internationally known investigative reporter for over 35 years, and he has been a correspondent for CNN's investigative unit. His nonfiction books include The Secret History of the CIA and Prelude to Terror. Once again, please welcome us in welcoming Mr. Trento and Mrs. Trento.
I'll let you start.
Okay. Thank you guys so much for coming. I thought I'd read a little from the book first. The sections involve Frank Argenbright. Richard Sanders, who's here tonight, asked us would we meet with Mr. Argenbright and listen to the story he had to tell. And we did, and that led us down this road towards this book, took us all over the world investigating airline security and intelligence issues. And I was going to read just a little bit, talk a little about the book, and then turn it over to Joe, and then we can have questions and answers. It was the morning of September 11th. In Atlanta, Frank Argenbright drove to work. Kathy Argenbright left the house early to play tennis. When Kathy Argenbright got home after a tennis game and heard what had happened, she immediately turned on the television. She prayed it had not been a security oversight. Then the phone rang. It was Bill Barber, the president of Argenbright Security. He was carrying on, Kathy Argenbright said, full of emotion. "Where's Frank?" Barber asked. "He's at work," she said. "Well, get in touch with him. This is very official. He cannot speak for Securicorps. He does not work for Securicorps. He in no way represents Securicorps. He cannot speak to anyone on our behalf." And he had me repeat what I was to tell Frank. I was shaking. I thought, what in the world is going on? So I called Frank and I couldn't reach him. But in the meantime, everyone was hitting him with what was going on. I didn't know what to do. So I just turned on the television, and there they were, immediately talking about airport security. At one point, before they were taking a commercial break, they even made the statement, could it be that Argenbright is part of this terrorist attempt? And then they took a break for the commercial. In the meantime, Securicorps contacted Frank at work and told him that they had this agreement and the contract and the $175 million they had paid him, and he would be liable for it if he broke the contract and he spoke. And Frank asked, but who is speaking? No one. So Frank called Russ Richards, his lawyer, to find out what legally he should do. And Russ said, you cannot speak. You have a contract with these people. You don't represent Securicorps. It's in your best interest to not speak. Frank Argenbright was relieved by the fact that the company that he had founded was not at fault in the 9/11 tragedy. But his relief was soon undercut by the realization that no one was reporting either that the screeners had done nothing wrong or that he had sold the company. In the meantime, in the media accounts, Frank Argenbright and Argenbright Security were interchangeable. and both were synonymous with the failure to prevent the hijackings. Security management began putting together an aggressive public relations campaign to deal with the aftermath of 9/11. And central to the plan at first was not to acknowledge that Security owned Argenbright Security. Argenbright Security was taking an unmerciful beating in the media, and Securicor's only strategic response was to let the fall blame on Frank Argenbright. For Kathy Argenbright, the life she and her husband had built was already threatened as AHL stock plummeted. But until 911, she had confidence that Frank would figure out a way to bring them back financially. Now the situation looked hopeless. At this point, I was trying to make sure I didn't leave Frank alone. I was afraid. I knew that Frank was the strongest man I'd ever known, but I thought this crossed the line, and I was really worried that he couldn't handle it. As he accepted his lawyer's advice and refused to comment, each and every story in the avalanche of negative press carried the line, Frank Argenbright was not available for comment. Philadelphia Inquirer, New York Times, New York Post, USA Today, Dateline, Wall Street Journal. Scores of others ran blistering stories about Argenbright Security. People tried to call me up, call my wife at home saying, "Where's Frank? He's not allowed to talk to anybody." So it's like, "What are you hiding?" Argenbright said. Angry calls began coming into AHL offices. Argenbright remembers all too well. "I had people calling AHL, 'We hate all of you. I can't believe you let those planes get through.' And one of the staff showed me some of the emails. She said, 'Frank, I'm not showing you most of them because they say they really want you to rot in hell.' And she said they would send the emails back saying, 'Look, we don't own it. We sold it. We don't have anything to do with it.' There was no way for Frank and Kathy Argenbright to know that there were separate events playing out in Washington, and that would have even more profound effects on their lives. In the aftermath of 9/11, everyone in the United States with any responsibility for safety and security of air travel wondered if he and she could have done more. But with one exception, none of them was held personally responsible. Only one American was blamed for 9/11. Through a combination of deliberate action and coincidence, a man sitting in his office in Atlanta, Georgia, became the public focus of attention as a person to blame for the worst foreign attack ever on American soil. Mike Capps, Argenbright's friend and former colleague, is now a high-ranking official in the Pentagon's Defense Security Service. In a suite of offices are huge pictures of the American airline plane that crashed into the Pentagon, fire blazing from the ruins. They serve as a constant reminder of what happened that clear September morning and the need to be forever vigilant. Capps says the true story of what happened to Frank Argenbright has never come out. Of the post-911 spin, he says, it had nothing to do with Frank Argenbright. It had to do, there needed to be a scapegoat. And this company that let the hijackers through had to take the blame. Somebody had to take the blame. On Friday, in the weeks that following 9/11, people were desperate for any bits of information about what had happened, what was going to happen in the future, and how the country was going to protect itself. On Friday, October 12th, 2001, Frank Argenbright's life changed forever. The Justice Department press office announced that Attorney General John Ashcroft would hold a press conference at 3:00 p.m. Wearing a dark suit and blue tie, the dour-looking Attorney General opened by announcing a terrorist indictment in Arizona. Then he said, "The United States Attorney in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania has charged Argenbright Holdings, otherwise known as Securicor, for violating the terms of a sentence that the company received a year ago for an astonishing pattern of crimes that could have jeopardized public security. Americans who travel through our airports and travel on the nation's airlines must and will be protected. Security companies at our airports will be held accountable for their actions. The Justice Department will enforce the law fully and vigorously to protect Americans. By putting the public spotlight on Argenbright security, John Ashcroft led the public to believe it was not his FBI and the Justice Department, not the CIA, not the White House or the National Security Agency that were to blame for 9/11, but the low-level airport screeners. He also set in motion a media tidal wave by mentioning airports around the country where Argenbright security was under review. Kathy Argenbright was watching CNN with her daughter, Blythe, as Ashcroft spoke. That's when it went from fear to anger. She said, "I sat there with my daughter watching the program. Unbelievable. That man is an evil man. I was looking at his face. Here's the family sitting there listening. It's unbelievable. You know, things happen to different people, and you watch what happens, and it's just that 99.9% of the time, you know it's never going to happen to you. Well, you're wrong. If it could happen to us, it could happen to anybody." To put an exclamation point on the public relations campaign, the White House press secretary later reiterated the Attorney General's statement. Kathy says they asked, "What should we do? What's going on? What can we do?" The only advice we got was, "It'll end soon. One day you'll wake up and you won't be in the news anymore." Help us, speak for us. No one would. The Argenbrights thought about suing to get their reputations back. But then, if you go to court, you don't know what will happen. We had huge bills. Can we do a lawsuit against a major company? No way. Are we going to sue the government? How do you do that? Is the news media going to report the truth? No. I had planned my suicide to the letter, Frank Argenbright says. Completely planned it out. I was going to do it secretly, quietly, and neatly. I would go out on the ocean early in the morning like I was going fishing. Once I was out of sight of land and with the tide going out so my body would go out to sea, I would take an overdose of sleeping pills, then handcuff some weights around my ankle. I would go into the water and hang on the side of the boat until I lost consciousness. The life jacket would left behind in the boat like I accidentally fell out. My body would never be found, and my death would be reported as a boating accident. Both Frank and Kathy Argenbright remember late 2001 and 2002 as living in a dark hole. I could be doing anything, Frank says, watching a movie, whatever, and I'd start thinking about all these things and just break down and cry. All by myself, anytime, day and night. I wasn't getting any sleep. I'd go to bed at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, couldn't sleep, get up at 5 exhausted. It was like experiencing hell through all 5 of my senses. Kathy will tell you how close I was to cashing it in her phrase. I mean, I was at the point where I just didn't care about anything. When you have lost your name, your integrity, and you're ashamed to even face your families and friends, it's an easy way out. Adding to his problem was the tamoxifen that he was supposed to take for another year. It was supposed to help prevent any reoccurrence of the cancer. I was supposed to, he says, but it also affected me mentally and emotionally. It made me soft. When I got upset, I would go off by myself and break down. I didn't even tell my wife about these breakdowns. She was already dealing with enough. Now is the time of my life, my reputation, my family, for me to fight. But this medicine was making me cry instead of fight. His oncologist was reluctant to take him off, but she finally agreed. That helped, he said, but it certainly didn't solve my problems. Frank and Kathy Argenbright had reached out for support to the Catholic Church. Father Devereaux went to the house and listened to them vent. He gave them spiritual tips to help them get through. Humanly speaking, it was very, very tough, he says. They had to see beyond the human side of things, rise above it, and try to find God's hand in all of it. What was God trying to tell me about this? But despite their prayers and search for meaning in the hurt and the pain, the campaign against Frank Argenbright had only just begun.
So
I'll turn this over to Joe, but I was just reading that to give you a feel. Frank Argenbright, of course, suffered greatly at being blamed for 9/11, but there were also tens of thousands of airport screeners who lost their jobs and their livelihood. One of the main points in the book is that 9/11 had absolutely nothing to do with airport screening. It was just a diversion. They were made scapegoats, a red herring, to make the public focus the public attention away from the intelligence failures that resulted in 9/11 and focus on airline screening and the airport screening. As a result, we ended up with TSA, where we're spending $5 billion a year. All of you've been through it. You know what it's like. And the testing, and Joe will talk to you a little bit more about this, but the testing shows that the private screeners were actually twice as good as the TSA screeners are today.
So John Ashcroft would not talk to us for 5 years. And I was on a radio show a few weeks ago in Chicago, the Mancow Show, which is kind of a right-wing Howard Stern. And I went on the show, and Mancow said to me about an hour into the show, he said, "You'll be amused to know that John Ashcroft's going to be on the show with you. Would you like to ask him a question?" And I said, "I certainly would like to ask him a question." So the question I asked him was, you demonized Argenbright Security and you demonized the funders, the screeners, ruined their lives. And how do you feel about that now? And Ashcroft hemmed and hawed for a minute. And then he said, well, we were in a panic. We had to do something. We had to reassure the public. And besides, all those people got their jobs back. Well, here's the truth. Those foreign-speaking screeners, those 25,000 who didn't look like us to most Americans, and who were replaced by guys who looked like they went to West Point and were in the military, that became the TSA, those guys didn't get their jobs. The government hired a private recruiting firm for the sole purpose of avoiding hiring laws. And so screeners who were experienced, who knew how to work those machines, who understood the process, were not rehired. And let me tell you the result 5 years later. The current TSA workforce, according to secret tests kept secret by the Department of Homeland Security, catch about half the test articles that the old private screeners did. The private screeners cost us $700 million a year, cost the airlines. The new screeners are $6 billion a year. And the one thing the 9/11 Commission told us was, get the intelligence straight. If you don't have the threat to aviation security solved before people get to the airport, then you can't protect the airplanes. And at the root of that is getting a watch list together, a unified watch list from all the intelligence agencies that is accurate, that reflects who the terrorists are and the threats to aviation security. And I brought something with me tonight. I want to show you. This is the no-fly list. It's secret. It's 44,000 names. And this is what the president refers to as evil. Okay? Unfortunately, the list is so inaccurate that it is virtually useless. There are Irish terrorists, there are fashion models, there are government bureaucrats and soldiers on this list. There are terrorists who are on other government watch lists who are not on this list. There is, for example, an American terrorist named David Belfield who took on the name Daoud Salahuddin, who committed murder in Washington, D.C. on behalf of the Ayatollah and other murders around the world. He's not on the no-fly list. There's a Cuban terrorist who was pardoned by Bush 1, Orlando Bosch. He blew up an airliner. He's not on the no-fly list. What we have done is create what the people at TSA who talk to us describe as eye candy. It's a facade. It's public relations. It's a fake. And let me tell you something that's happened in recent years. Improvised explosive devices have been found behind security lines at Seattle SeaTac, at Los Angeles International, and at Atlanta airports. At LA International, a wheelchair pusher who was handling an old lady in the Thomas Bradley terminal found a gun taped behind a toilet. Okay? Now, these are the things TSA doesn't tell you. All right. Now, you all recall last summer, we were all told about this great business about the British plot, where, surprise, surprise, they're going to blow up 12 airliners over the Atlantic using chemical explosives. Well, let's talk about connecting the dots. In 1994, the CIA, through very good police work in the Philippines, got a hold of a guy named Murad in his computer, and they learned that they were building small chemical bombs. And actually it tested one. They killed a Japanese businessman on a Philippine air flight. And we knew in 1994 that they were doing it, that they were planning it. And so in the middle of the night at 3 o'clock in the morning, TSA says, surprise, surprise, passengers, you can't bring shampoo or toothpaste on the planes. These folks are utterly and completely incompetent to protect our airways. And the quicker we as Americans realize that and understand what we're dealing with, the quicker we'll realize that we've been wasting a lot of money and a lot of effort. For example, while you and I are standing in line and taking off our belts and handing them our laptops and doing all the other things, there are 600,000 airport workers who go into the airports every day carrying toolboxes, carrying lunch kits, carrying everything else, and they're not screened, they're not checked, and all the stuff that's delivered into the airport is not inspected, it's not x-rayed. So in the front of the airport we have this wonderful security facade, but surrounding and behind the airport we have a 1/4-inch plywood fence. So people say, well, why hasn't something happened? It must be better. Nothing's happened. They haven't killed anybody lately. I remind people that the first attack on the World Trade Center was 1993. It was 2001 when they brought down the building. These folks are extraordinarily patient. And this administration's response has been a military solution to what, in my view, and what most security people's view, is a police problem. These are bad guys. These are criminals. Terrorism, war on terror, terror is a technique. And so we've declared war on a technique. It's sort of like declaring war on missiles or declaring war on jiu-jitsu. It makes no sense. You target people who are criminals and not their whole society. What you do when you target their whole society is create a response to you that you hate us all. And you recruit for them. And that's fundamentally what we've been doing. Now, why would these folks be mad at the United States? I wanted to answer that question. And Susan, fortunately, and you should tell the story, had a source, an unusual source.
I had a source that said, you stay right here.
I'm just going to move this.
Okay.
It's kind of heavy.
I had a source that said, well, what are you working on? I said, well, I'm working on a book about airline security. He said, oh, you are? He says, would you like to meet a hijacker? And I said, well, yeah. Who do you have in mind? He goes, I know a hijacker. I said, who do you know? Oh, the guy in Beirut? And I said, the TWA? Yeah. The guy that threw the Navy diver's body out on the tarmac? Yeah, I know him. You want to meet him? I was like, yeah, I do. Can you give me the number, cell number? Okay, fine. So I sent Joe to see him.
She's done this, by the way, in a number of books. Anyway, the guy's name was Fuz Yunus. And Fuz Yunus is very interesting. He's the only guy to ever hijack 2 airplanes in 1 week. He hijacked an Air Jordan plane with 9 sky marshals aboard, okay, successfully. And he was able to identify the sky marshals by the fact that they didn't have boarding passes. They were traveling free. So just a little good intelligence work. But the real question was, how did he get access to Beirut Airport so easily? Why was it so easy for him to do all this? Well, it turns out that the real power behind these hijackings was the very guy that the U.S. had put on its payroll many years before, our private conduit to Iran, a man named Nabi Berri, who is currently Condi Rice's best friend in their favorite democracy of Lebanon, who was then head of the Amal militia. And the Amal militia was sort of the nice front group for Hezbollah. Anyway, Barry thought, you know, I need to build up my street credibility with Hezbollah, because they're a tough crowd. And then I need the United States to believe I can do these things, so they give me the goodies like citizenship for my family and money and all these things. And I need to keep the Iranians happy, because I need to keep that door open. So I'm going to do everything. I'm going to hijack airplanes, arrange to hijack airplanes, then rescue the people being hijacked, give them back to the United States, and be the hero. Well, what had gone wrong was, while our guy, Fouz, was in a safe house after his successful hijacking where nobody got killed to protest Palestinian presence in Lebanon, he used Islamic Jihad to hijack a TWA plane, and the guys went crazy and started killing passengers and beating them up, and they killed Robbie Stedham, the diver. So in the middle of the night, Fouz Yunus and his team was snuck aboard the plane at Beirut Airport, and he was given the instruction, if they don't cooperate with him, kill them, take over the hijacking, and he did. And Nabi Berri got what he wanted. We eventually got the survivors of the TWA plane back, and Nabi Berri became a power broker in the Middle East. Now, years later, the CIA had hired a criminal gang in Lebanon named the Hamdan family. And Jamel Hamdan was not your average Boy Scout. And you can read about him in Bob Baer's new novel, because while I and Susan was doing this book, the nonfiction version, Baer was writing a fictional version, because he was with the CIA and he can't do this, of the same story. But Hamdan is now a very active family, and I use the term nicely, here in the Northern Virginia area, spying on the Arab community, running cigar stores, doing other things. But at that time, besides killing his sister-in-law and killing a Beirut doctor in a traffic dispute, he was also working for the CIA. And what he was doing for the CIA was creating the illusion of a Libyan terrorist cell that was supposed to be conducting terrorist acts all over Europe. And then Hamdan was called upon to do something else. We need to catch a terrorist. The Marines had all been killed in the barracks in Beirut. By the way, Nabi Berri's people, his guards, let the Marines be attacked because he allowed Hezbollah to come in and do the bombing. Same thing with the CIA station, other things. But he was on our payroll. And the Hamdan family was used again. And this time they were used to lure Fouz Yunus onto a boat in the middle of the Mediterranean and fly him to Washington as the first terrorist to be put on trial by the Reagan administration. So we got ourselves a terrorist. We got Fouz Yunus, who never killed anybody, by the way, and actually saved the lives of everybody on that TWA flight, with the exception of Robbie Stedham had already been murdered. Didn't matter. The one thing in the trial that was not allowed to come out, they had tapes, was talking about Nabi Berri's role in ordering the hijackings. They kept that from getting into the trial. Now, what do they do with Fouz Yunus? They put him in jail for 18 years. And who do you think his roommate is? They put him in jail with Ed Wilson, the notorious CIA arms dealer, and Ed taught him everything he knew. And by the time we let him out, a couple of years ago, Fouz Yunus spoke perfect English and had street credibility like you couldn't imagine, and he flies back on a commercial airplane, even though he's on the no-fly list, he flies back on a commercial airline to Beirut to a hero's welcome. So I went to see him and I said, can you tell me why your friends who participated in TWA, including the guys who actually murdered Robbie Stedham, are allowed not to roam around Beirut and not be arrested? There's a $5 million U.S. reward on every one of them. And he says, you're so innocent. He says, they're protecting Berri. They're protecting Hezbollah. I said, why would the Reagan administration protect Hezbollah? He said, timing is everything. He said, what was going on in the 1980s? You're a reporter, what did you miss? He says, Iran-Contra. This was the other side of the Iran-Contra scandal. The negotiations the Reagan administration was doing with Iran were more important than really collecting on terrorists and getting them. And that's what we engaged in. So that may be one reason why when the United States says it's going to fight terrorism around the world, our credibility may be a little bit tattered. Let me give you another reason. It's not 6 months before the blowing up of Pan Am 103, this tragic explosion that killed all these American kids from Syracuse and some CIA officers and some other people. The United States did something that was very unattractive. We shot down an Iranian Airbus and we lied about it. The USS Vincennes was in Iranian territorial waters, actually monitoring a Navy SEAL operation at a time when it, within the waters, shot down a civilian airliner and killed hundreds of people. And we lied. The vice president lied about it, the president lied about it, and we lied about it at the UN, and we falsified evidence. We had the Navy actually at the Dahlgren Proving Ground make fake tapes to prove the ship wasn't where it really was. And the Iranians knew we lied. That started an arms race. The Iranians went to China and France and said, we need defenses against U.S. military. And they ordered a system called the C-802 cruise missile system, a devastating system which can sink any U.S. ship. And they bought them, and they got them. And we saw the end result of that in the short war last summer when the Iranians were there, the Revolutionary Guard were there, and they shot off a cruise missile, one of these 802s, at the SS Hanat, the Israeli ship that almost sank. So there are consequences to foreign policy affecting the civilians. And if you don't look at those short-term foreign policy gains in light of what can happen down the road to airline passengers, to citizens of your country, there are huge, huge costs. Now, at Dulles Airport, on the night of September 10th,
Iranian airline.
Airbus, yeah. Iranian,
Airbus.
right.
Did they do it deliberately? Was this?
No, it was an accident.
It was an accident.
But we lied about it.
Why the hell wouldn't Iran know that it was an accident? No.
Why would they believe that we didn't do it? We were conducting operations against in Iranian territorial waters, military operations.
Yeah, but it was an accident.
Yeah, it was an accident that we lied about. Had we shot it down and then immediately called the president of Iran and said, we made a mistake, we misidentified it, we were in your waters, this might not have escalated, but it did. And Iran used Hezbollah and Libya to then put a bomb on a U.S. airliner and explode it and kill innocent civilians. Tit for tat. That's the view. Eye for an eye. And that is the background out there that airline security doesn't talk about. That's the background that TSA doesn't discuss. But every passenger is living with that baggage on their shoulders. And that's why it's so important for Americans to focus on the reality of this. I mean, what we're really facing here. It's serious stuff. And it's depressing stuff. And unless we face up to the fact that we can't just create this illusion of security, that we really have to know it. And there's easy ways of doing it. There's fixes. Let me give you an example. That watch list, the airlines get that on a computer disk. And it's like a spreadsheet. But the reason they keep getting little kids with the same names as people as terrorists on the watch list, like 4-year-olds, there was a kid in San Diego who had the name of some terrorist and they keep stopping him, is because there's no biometric identifiers. The intelligence agency won't pass on the pictures, the fingerprints, the other stuff that allow you to, so they don't trust the airline, so they don't give them the stuff. So instead of doing that, what we need to do is have the government keep that list. Once you make a reservation or buy a ticket on an airplane, the government sees the name, and it's up to the government to then vet the passenger list. Take it away from the airlines. Right now, what we've set up is the airlines are the last line of defense. In fact, the last line of defense on an airplane these days, because of the cabin door and so forth, is the steward. That's pretty scary. But it's up to the passengers and the steward to save the stewards to save the plane. Sure. Oh, they got another list for that. The way it works is it's like getting a college scholarship. You have to go before a committee, and each government agency nominates people to the no-fly list. When this all started, there were 16 names on the list. There's 44,000 names on that list, okay? And what happens is each agency brings in a name. Well, why would you have Irish terrorists on the list? Many of them are dead, by the way. But why would you have them on there anyway? They raise money here. They're not going to come here and blow up airliners, okay? So that doesn't, this is aviation security we're talking about. Why would you have a fashion model on the list? There is one on there, okay? Why do you have 4-year-old children on the list? It's full of mistakes. Well, the government agencies get together and garbage in, garbage out. So you have a situation where you've got all these government agencies having lists. It all started with the National Criminal Information Database, the FBI's list. Now, the FBI is very proud of this list publicly. Privately, they're embarrassed by it because it's full of mistakes. And the old private screening companies used to have a situation where they wanted to vet their employees because they get in trouble if they hired a criminal. So they wanted to use the NCIC list to vet their employees. FBI said no. The reason the FBI said no was because they never wanted to let the public know how bad this list was, how out of date it was, the mistakes on the list. So they never shared it. Well, anyway, they finally did share it. And that became the basis of the no-fly list. And then the CIA gave a bunch of names and so forth. Well, the problem is, if you're an intelligence officer and you're working an Al-Qaeda case and you've got a guy you're using who's a bad guy, you're not going to give, say, the current alias to the airlines. You're going to keep that to yourself because you want him to be able to travel so you can follow him around. Well, that sort of contradicts the idea of protecting the airplanes. And I'll give you an example. Honey Hanjour was the guy who flew the plane into the Pentagon. A little guy flew the plane into the Pentagon. He went to flight school in Phoenix. One of his buddies who went to flight school in Phoenix with him, good friend of his, somehow is one of the few guys who's not grabbed and thrown into detention after 9/11. Very strange. So he ends up being questioned by the FBI 5 or 6 times and then let go. And the CIA picks him up. And suddenly, last January, we find him flying into New Zealand. And we call New Zealand intelligence and we tell them, let him in. And he says to the New Zealand authorities, why are you here? I'm here to study interior decorating and improve my English. So about 4 months later, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Clark, finds out that this guy is actually taking flight training in a town called Palmerston North. And, you know, his instructor finds it a little strange that he knows how to take off with giant airliners but doesn't know how to land them. And he calls the authorities. And the Prime Minister calls a halt to this little nonsense. And he's allowed to fly out of the country on an international airline. And he's one of many that we allowed to do this. We're not telling the airlines who's flying them. We're keeping names from them. The no-fly list is a joke. And the idea that we're now trusting Saudi GID, in the case of this operation, that's Saudi intelligence, is pretty interesting, and I'll tell you why. You may remember that 2 of the Saudi guys who flew the 9/11 flew the American Airlines plane into the Pentagon had attended a little meeting in Malaysia in January of 2000. And we later learned that money from the Saudi embassy had been transferred to them while they lived in the San Diego area and other things. Well, they were Saudi intelligence agents. And the reason George Bush and everybody in our government wasn't all upset when we got these bin Ladens determined to attack memos and so forth was because the Saudis told us, we got it wired, it's okay, we're inside Al-Qaeda, no problem. Well, they were wrong. So now, 5 years later, we find our intelligence agencies assuring us we got it covered. We can keep track of these guys. We won't lose them a second time. So, yeah. We're doing the same things we did before 9/11. We don't have the watch list. The agencies aren't talking to each other. TSA is the low list on the totem pole.
Why don't you put their names back on the list?
Well,
Doesn't make any difference.
it doesn't make any difference. I mean, by the way, their names were on the list, but the New Zealand intelligence authorities were told by their CIA buddies, do us a favor, ignore it. So, yes, ma'am.
Yeah, we were talking about 1994 Malaysia, that they already had experimented with chemical explosives.
Yeah, the Mirage business,
Yes.
yeah.
So it made me kind of curious also with the no-fly list where Argenbright, like private security firms, got their screening guidelines from. What did they operate under? How did they?
Actually very similar to what they're operating under now. By the way, the whole idea of the box cutter thing, which was the big thing that was put out there, you were allowed to carry box cutters on flights, or any 4-inch blade. If they caught the hijackers with the box cutters, they would have been given back to them and allowed to go on. The hijackers were too smart for that because they wouldn't try and secrete them on them. But what we learned at Dulles Airport on the night before was that there was an attempt to breach security at Dulles that was very serious. Eric Safri's Guild, who happened to be a Pakistani national Oregon Bright supervisor, stopped 5 guys dressed in United Airlines ground crew, baggage handler uniforms, those blue pants, striped shirts, trying to go through security on a badge. They were piggybacking. On the West Checkpoint, there was an electronic door, and they were trying to get through there. Now, you would think that's great because that means that we have an electronic record of who went through the door. We have videotape of who went through those doors and may have approached the airplane because Dulles had cameras. One little problem, and Mike Pilgrim there is the one who told me about it. After the attacks, all the hard drives which contained that information were confiscated by the FBI. Dulles was blind for how long, Mike? A week? A week. And the 9/11 Commission never got this material. Nobody ever saw it. Eric Gill knew that there was one other Oregon Bright official who was at the door at the bottom of the ramp going to the planes, who they could have talked to. Only one little problem. The next day, the officials came in from INS and deported everybody who wasn't a citizen at the airport, including that guy, and he was never questioned by the 9/11 Commission, by the FBI, by anyone.
Why didn't the 9/11 Commission get the material?
Good question.
No answer.
Yeah, good question. We've asked. I mean, there are a lot of things they didn't. I mean, for example, on the night before the hijacking, staying at the Residence Inn Hotel with the hijackers in the same building. In fact, they moved from another hotel there, was the leading Saudi funder of mosques in the United States. He had just the week before taken a tour of the World Trade Center. I mean, it may mean nothing, but when the FBI tried to question him, a female FBI agent tried to question him, he feigned a heart attack. And then Prince Bandar arranged for him to leave the country. I mean, there are a lot of the things that went on at Dulles Airport that night are very interesting and demand further explanation. Yes?
What's the communication between us, England, France, or other countries in the world, Israelis, these lists? Do they communicate with one another? These people must be on the same list.
Almost none.
There's no communication.
Because the real list, this list is what the airlines get. The real list is kept by the intelligence services. And they may want to tell a certain intelligence service, they may want to share it, but the reality is if they don't trust the intelligence service, they're not going to give it to them. Now, the Israelis who run the best security in the world, I mean, you talk about profiling and all the things that we think security ought to be, they're the best at it. We have not adopted any of that for the simple reason it's too expensive. That's why we're not doing it. It's too intrusive, we think. The airlines don't want to do it because it would hurt business. And remember, the whole history of airline security in this country has been based on economics. Look, after Pan Am 103 was blown up, William Webster got the job as a lobbyist for the airline security, the former FBI director, got the job as the lobbyist for the airline lobbying group for all the airlines. He goes up in Congress and says, this isn't necessary. We don't need stronger regulations. We don't need to do this. And we didn't do it. The Europeans did. And ironically, the guy who did it, who saw an opportunity, was Frank Argenbright, who ran the cheap screening for the airlines here. He went over to Europe, hired some of the Israeli guys, hired some other people, and created Air Defense International, which gave us that vaunted European security that our airlines wouldn't pay for. He did it over there. And the reason SecureCorps bought his company a year before 9/11 was they wanted that security company over there, and what they got here was just a bonus. Yes?
So on screening, I recognize that you advocate fixing what goes on behind the scenes because that's a major problem. Do you think I should be taking my belt off and taking my
No.
shoes off and all that other crap in line?
I think that the idea that you're going to catch anything but a lunatic at the screening centers is just pure fiction.
I think we should just go through, keep our shoes on, and not take our laptops off, and we should be allowed to carry shampoo.
I think you should be allowed to carry shampoo. And by the way, now so does TSA. And I'll tell you a story about that. We set up a blog on we have a little website for the book, and we set up a kind of a blog for people. And one of the first emails we got was from a guy who had a friend whose brother was an INS agent. This is after 9/11. And the brother had his water bottle taken away from him, but was allowed to carry his Glott machine gun on board. Okay? So there seems to be a disconnect between what we ought to be doing.
Screening was originally set up to catch, nuts, to catch up some, like just somebody who was going to hijack a plane to try to deter them from bringing in a gun or a bomb. It's never designed to catch terrorists. Terrorists are always going to test the system, and they're going to go about, doing whatever. If TSA says you can carry this on board or not that on board, they'll know that ahead of time. One of the top aviation security said on 9/11, if the terrorists had gone through naked, they could have found a way to bring down those planes. They could have gone to the bathroom and, broken a mirror and, used whatever, because they were trained terrorists, hijackers. So that's, the screening to make us go through all of that is almost irrelevant, except as a deterrent for a nut who, might think twice about bringing a gun on.
The irony of this administration's approach to just about everything is kind of public relations. It's making us feel better. It's, the Morning in America idea, the idea if you see an American flag and a guy or a woman who looks good in uniform, and you see the National Guard walking through the airports, you're going to feel better about it. Sorry. The whole idea of screening in the TSA model from this administration is public relations. It's the idea of making us feel better about security, the idea that there is security. The idea that we look at it and, okay, now we're going to spend the money and buy our ticket. Remember, the fear after 9/11, and there was validity to this, was we weren't going to fly anymore because it was too scary. And that's what they had to deal with. And so you've got to give them some level of understanding for that. But the problem is, we're 5 years down the road, and they haven't fixed anything. And that's what's really scary.
Well, one of the biggest problems with TSA was that when they were creating it, which was out of panic and fear, they did it in like 60 days. They didn't even hold congressional hearings. It was just done like, okay, this is a great idea, let's do it, and that's it. $5 billion a year. We got like 44,000 TSA agents. There are only like 12,000 FBI special agents, so it's like this huge bureaucracy. The people in charge had never worked airport security. We had people in charge who were from the Coast Guard. We had people in charge who came from the Secret Service. We had people in charge who came from the Navy. They never manned checkpoints. They didn't know what they were doing. They thought if they put people in good uniforms and paid them more money that they'd be better than those horrible private screeners. Well, when you talk to TSA, off the record, and you ask them, they will tell you, if you go apples to apples, gun to gun, pipe bomb to pipe bomb, the private screening companies caught between 80 and 95%. If they got less than 80% when they were tested, and they were tested all the time, all day long, they had people watching them from the FAA, they had people from the DOT's IG, they had, airport managers, they had the airlines testing them, they were people on them all. If they got below 80%, they could lose their contract, they were out of work. So they were always trying to improve and catch the weapons. TSA, they catch maybe 40%. If they get 50%, they tell themselves they're doing a great job, and they give each other parties and give themselves awards and that kind of thing. That's half as good as what the private screeners were. It's become a huge federal bureaucracy, so naturally they're going to take advantage of the system. So the TSA managers will tell you that the employees will know that they can't get rid of them. If they can hire, they'll hire people, and they'll know in 3 months, it'll take them that long to fire them, so they don't show up for a couple of months and then just take the money and go home. They have the highest rate of workers' compensation of anybody, private or public. At any time they got 30% of the workforce out on workers' compensation, I call the private screening companies. At any given time, how many do you have out on workers' compensation? About 1% to 2%, 3% maybe. That's it. So we have this huge bureaucracy that's half as good as what we used to have. And, we're paying for it.
Do you see a problem of congressional oversight missing?
Yeah, there is none. I mean,
Do you think that might change with the new administration?
I'm hoping it will, but some of the Democrats who really wanted this, I mean, you got to understand something. This is a bipartisan screw-up. The Democrats wanted this, but you know who the real king of TSA is? The guy who really got this through and convinced George Bush, who was reluctant about, having a public entity of this scale, was John McCain. This was John McCain's baby. And he is more responsible for the creation of TSA than anyone. And, he has to live with this. But politicians don't think backwards very often. So, but I think there will be more. I think even Micah and some of the people who are in charge of the committees would now pay attention to this and start looking at it. I mean, a lot of them are really angry. I mean, there's been one GAO report after another about how bad TSA is. But it's not all TSA's fault. I mean, Homeland Security is not a very good agency and not very well run. But look, TSA has to go hat in hand to the intelligence community. So everything they get, they have to beg for from the intelligence community. And that's pretty tough when you have no seniority and the White House doesn't back you.
Screening to get for the airlines to stop a terrorist from becoming a baggage claim person after our luggage has gone through screening and that person puts it on the plane. How do we know the person
Let me
puts it on the plane
reassure you
doesn't
that
stick a bomb in my suitcase?
Let me
in the
reassure you.
screening?
It's as good as being a taxi driver. It's as there's a private firm that does this for the government. They charge about $50 or $60, and you can get a badge and so forth. The problem is that at Dulles in April, Mike, am I right about this? Where they had the immigration raid out at Dulles, and they found 4 illegal aliens with all access passes to control tower, every place in the airport. So it's pretty easy to get in there. It's pretty easy to get a pass. And look, let's be just brutally honest here. These are low-wage jobs for the most part. These people, clean toilets and sell you pizza, and they're the invisible people who are in our world every day. They're struggling. Most of them have 2 or 3 jobs. So they are hardworking. But let me tell you something. If somebody came to you and either threatened you or threatened your family back home or offered you what seemed like more money than you'd ever imagined to borrow a badge, you might take that. And right now, that is the greatest weakness of this system.
We spent $20 million to arrest those units that we were talking about earlier. We lured them onto a yacht off of Cyprus. We took them to an aircraft carrier. We flew them straight to the United States. They did a flight refueling to get him here so he didn't touch the earth until he got to the United States. We arrested, tried and put him in jail. He was in jail for 18 years, and not one person in the government asked him, how did you hijack the planes?
Never interviewed him?
How did you do it? Because one of the answers was, with the TWA, was that they had used people inside the airport and to hide some of the weapons.
Yeah, the cleaning crew in Athens for the airplane got the weapons in the transit lounge, and that's how they got them aboard. Then they secreted them in the restrooms on the plane. But we never knew that, and nobody bothered asking. Can you imagine? No airline security person, nobody from the FAA, nobody ever went to see this guy. It's kind of strange. Any other questions? It's up to you. It's up to you. I mean,
How'd you get here?
we flew JetBlue. No, tonight we drove, but I still prefer flying. I think you've got to also look at the odds. We Americans are really kind of silly sometimes, If you lost a plane a year to terrorism, and I hate to be brutal about this, but if you lost a plane a year to terrorism, with all the flights that take place, That's still a lot lower than car accidents and all the other bad things that can happen to you, or the British train system, you know. Right, well, if you're not on it. But, you know, also other things happen. Bolts fall off airplanes, bad things happen. So sometimes we expect perfection in our lives, and perfection isn't achievable. And security is a matter of what you're willing to pay for and what you're willing to put up with. But you don't want to put up with stuff when it's not doing anything. And you don't want to pay for stuff when it's not doing anything. So we just need to be, all we want is a little reality in the system, so we're not surprised again. And, you know, I mean, look, there is no defense against small liquid bombs. You know, TSA has not found in 2 months a magic solution to detect things in bombs, okay? They can't magically look at your shampoo just to make you feel, I don't want to make you feel bad, but you know those big sniffer machines you now walk through at Dulles and some of the other airports that blow air on you? Well, they're great, but they don't work after about 10 minutes. Because if they have to have the filters changed and be recalibrated and all those things. And our TSA people aren't trained to do that. So this government is great at spending money on huge amounts of technology. And they buy the stuff, and most of the stuff doesn't work. So just keep that in mind. So, you know, if you see somebody carrying on something strange, or somebody says, can you carry this bag aboard for me? I've got too much hand luggage. That should set off alarm bells. Be aware just be aware. Yes?
Did I understand you correctly that you said you wanted, I'm back to the no-fly list with those names. You said that control should be taken out, away from the airlines, and the government should check?
The government, you can't, the reason they do this is if there's another, it's all political. If there's another incident, a plane goes down and it's hijacked, well, the airline they didn't tell us. Oh, well, that's too bad. Pick a government agency, FAA, CIA, FBI, whoever you want to pick, and say it's your job to monitor every passenger that's flying in America. You need to know who's flying. And if you want to fly, you have an obligation to tell the government who the hell you are. That is an expectation. I consider myself a civil libertarian, but that's an expectation that I would be willing to, that's one area of liberty I'd be willing to forego, with the assurance that we knew what we were doing. This idea that you're entitled to get on a jetliner anonymously of something that can be turned into a missile is just crazy. I agree with the government on that. But I want real security, and that means the government's going to tell you who you are, the government's going to know who this is, and then if you're wrongly on the list, you want to know the best way to fix the no-fly list? I should print that thing in the newspaper tomorrow, and I'll tell you why. Because Americans will vet that list. The most effective crime list we have is the 10 most wanted list the FBI uses. That's how we catch the bad guys. John Walsh does his television show, catches bad guys all the time. Only this administration would keep secret who the bad guys are from the American public. I mean, try and figure out the logic of this. I mean, wouldn't it be better if we all knew who they were? And the reason they don't tell you is because they really don't know. And that is scary. I can't tell you. I'd have to kill you, and that wouldn't be nice. Yes.
You know, when there's an airline crash, the federal government sends people from the National Transportation Safety Administration to investigate and put the thing back together and do all this kind of stuff to determine how how the accident happened. Now, do they do a reliable job? Can they be trusted?
They can be trusted, but we have other agencies that sometimes go along to the sites that might not be so trustworthy. I mean, it happens. It depends on what the interest is. Pan Am 103, unfortunately, had some CIA people on site who were accused of tampering with evidence later by the Scottish authorities. You know, I mean, they may have been there because their people were on the plane. It may have had nothing to do with tampering with evidence, but that was the accusation. Look, the Transportation Safety Board does a great job most of the time. You know, you can't figure out every crash. And you may remember the flight that went down off Long Island that we thought, a lot of people thought had been a missile because of that contrail that turned out to be an electrical problem in the main fuel tank of the airplane. You know, they figured it out finally. But the reality is, we're not perfect. And all the technology and everything can't always put things back together so we know. But sometimes governments do behave badly, including ours. Yes, ma'am.
Who was interested to cover up the Dallas security breach?
I'm sorry.
Dallas security breach. Who was interested to cover that up?
Which breach?
The Dallas airport security.
Oh, Dulles? Well, the marching orders to the FBI were pretty obvious. The administration had decided that the screeners were the bad guys. And what they did when they went to first question the screeners, they brought them downstairs into the baggage area of the airport, and they divided them up, and they started questioning them, and they basically challenged the way they wanted the hijackers. And Susan has an interesting story to tell you about the recognition of the hijackers and how quickly it was done.
Well, actually, if you want to know more about it, Steve Ragg's here, and he was in charge of that checkpoint that morning. But Ed Nelson worked for him, and he was there. Steve got there after the hijackings, but Ed was there, that morning. And he was in charge of the west checkpoint where the hijackers came through. And, of course, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people going through that checkpoint that morning because, it was the early morning flights, which everybody's trying to get to, Los Angeles, New York, everything like that. After, of course, the planes hit the Pentagon and the World Trade Center and crashed in Pennsylvania, they shut down the airport. And the FBI and as Steve said, everybody with a badge and a gun was out at Dulles Airport running around, trying to figure out what was going on. The FBI asked Ed to get a copy of the videotapes, which you've seen now on TV, the 911 Commission showed, where it shows the hijackers going through the West checkpoint. He got it, and he was looking at it, waiting, for the FBI to get there to look at it, and he's looking at it, and he's looking at it, and he's looking at it. Everything looks fine to him. People are going through, everybody's going through, nothing looks out of the ordinary. The FBI gets there, and they look at it, and they go, there's our guy, there's our guy, there's our guy, there's our guy, there's our guy. That morning, they knew who the 5 were. If they knew that morning, they knew who they were the day before or the day before that, okay? So there was no way, if you didn't already know who they were, you could have picked them out. They were clean cut. If you saw you've seen the tapes, they didn't go like all 5 of them through. There were 2 and then 2. If you looked at the procedures that the screeners followed, they were precision screening. They did everything that was required and more.
Dulles Airport has a problem because there's metal rebar in the floor at Dulles Airport, in the cement floors. And so you can't take the screening wands down all the way to the bottom of the shoes, because then the metal detectors will go off. So some people have pointed to the fact that they didn't do that as a criticism of the screeners. In fact, there's the people who are filing some of the lawsuits have done that. It's nonsense. The screening procedures were perfect. So the question is, what did the FBI ask these screeners about? They didn't say, well, what did you see? Did you see anything extra? They went over the screening procedures again and again and again. And that's because sitting on the desk of the Attorney General was the Argenbright security violations from Philadelphia Airport from several years before, where Argenbright Security had hired people at Philadelphia Airport who'd faked high school diplomas, they had a shortage of screeners there, who'd faked other things, and they had a supervisor who'd done all that. The company paid $1 million fine. But after 9/11, this was the perfect way to hang the company out. And that's what they did. And by pointing to the screeners, you could say Argenbright was doing this all over the country. Now, you remember the Attorney General quote that she was reading you about all these terrible things that Argenbright screened? Well, TSA has hired more criminals, has had more people taking stolen property. All the things that Argenbright Security was accused of and charged criminally has happened again and again at TSA, multiple locations, multiple times, and no U.S. attorney, as far as I know, TSA charges.
Do you see any similarities between the no-fly list and the State Department's use of lookout system?
I knew you were going to ask me that. Yeah. Mike was the visa officer in Jeddah. And every time the CIA wanted to bring a terrorist into the United States, they went to his boss and he stamped them back in the 80s. So he has some experience in this area. Well, they created the mess. They did it. It was political cover. You know, there was a reaction. Ken Mead, who was the Inspector General at FAA, had been wanting to federalize the screeners for years, and that's kind of where it all started. And then it became one of the great ideas that was floating around was to keep the private screeners, but have federal supervision of the private screeners instead of the airlines. Because the airlines would, give them a slap on the wrist when they made a mistake or screwed up. So there was no real supervision. Had that been done, we would have saved a lot of money and been better off, and the lines would have been shorter. But Congress just doesn't do the oversight. This Congress doesn't do any oversight. I mean, it's just this Congress. Oh, yeah. Oh, no. Believe me. Although none of them had ever seen the... One thing about the no-fly list, to my everlasting shock, after we gave it to 60 Minutes... Ira Rosen, the producer for the 60 Minutes story, went into Kip Hawley, the head of TSA, and Wim Gatchis, the chief of intelligence, bringing the list in with him, just like that. Brought the list in, and he's reading things from the list. And Hawley and Gatchis both admitted they had never seen the no-fly list. So if your chief of intelligence has never bothered to look at it, I think we got a problem. This is the last line of defense, supposedly. That's what we're told. The last line of defense. This is the thing that keeps the bad guys off the airlines. And they never even looked at it. And by the way, I have the list. It's supposed to be classified. I have never received a call from the government asking for it back. Now, they did call CBS and ask for it back, and CBS said, well, call Trento. And so, but I never heard from them. And we're in the book. So.
Okay.
There are lots of inspector generals who make recommendations, and nobody pays any attention to them. How would Ken Mead get something like that done?
Well, he actually was a very powerful guy in FAA, but the airlines fought him and the airline lobby fought him. But, his solution was what we have now, and it's really not working. The biggest thing was the fact that we didn't do the profiling, the fact that we didn't go to a much tougher form of screening after the Pan Am 103 disaster. The Gore Commission, after the TWA flight off of Long Island, when they first thought it was terrorism, made serious recommendations that were now, some of which we've implemented, that would have been good. But we didn't follow those either. And it's all because the airline lobbying has been just prodigious and severe. I mean, these folks are really good at spending money. They're like the NRA. I mean, they're very efficient. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.